Hi, everyone. We're just going to let people log in and then we'll just start momentarily. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Fulford, and I'm the CEO here at IPAC. And thank you very much for joining us for our session today on managing in complexity, how our fears of uncertainty hurt us and what to do about it. And today's session is going to be interactive. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Sara Filbee, who's going to be talking about her book and sharing her experiences. And I'm thrilled that Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, is going to be our moderator. Gina will be asking some questions, and Sara and Gina will go back and forth, but we do want you to have an opportunity to ask questions. So I would ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and just put your questions in during the session. Now, what would also be helpful right now, if you could just use the chat and let us know where you're participating from in our country. I do want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So with participants joining virtually from coast to coast, we acknowledge and respect the ancestral and unceded territories of all First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We encourage everyone here to take the opportunity to learn about the diverse and unique histories, cultures, and aspirations of the people on whose territories you work and live. And we ask you to determine how you can take action towards reconciliation. So just a quick reminder, Q&A feature where we want you to put your questions, and also just in the chat, let us know where you're participating from. And with that, I'm thrilled now to hand it over to Gina, who is going to moderate today's session. Gina, over to you.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here today. And hi, Sara.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
I'm over in Algonquin territory right now. Sara, how about you? Where are you?
I'm on the territory of Mi'kma'ki.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone, and happy to be here to talk a little bit about this book, Managing in Complexity. So I'm going to actually start out with a question, but just wanted to acknowledge that Sara is a good friend of mine. We became colleagues when we were fellow assistant deputy ministers at the then Aboriginal Affairs. I'm not sure what it was called, INAC at the time, but we worked together quite closely on a whole number of initiatives. But then we became friends as well. So I wanted to talk about that, our friendship and our collegiality, and I was so happy to get her book and take a read and talk to you about it today. So maybe I'll just start by asking, and what's the puppy's name, Sara?
Oh, I'm sorry, this is Romeo.
Oh, Romeo. Hi, Romeo.
And he is a real Romeo. So when he heard that there was a whole bunch of people online, he just thought he had to come and say hi.
Wonderful. Well, we say hi to him. All right, Sara. So when I was looking at this, my first question, when I was actually looking at the title is what do you mean by complexity? Can you give us a little bit of that for starters?
Yeah, it's an important question because a lot of people use the word complexity and actually when you start to break it down, you begin to understand why it makes life so difficult inherently. The best way I've found to explain it is to compare filling out and completing a really difficult Sudoku. Let's say it's got 6 numbers in there. Well, theoretically, you can solve that. Once you've solved it, you can do it again. You just do the same thing that you did before. It's got an answer, it's determinate. Well, now the complex side of things is having a kid or having several. You can, let's say you have 3 kids, you bring them up, born in the same hospital or born in the same house, live there, go to the same church if you go to church, go to school, same parents, same relatives, same friend set, and yet all 3 of them will develop into completely different human beings. And that's because of the workings of complexity. Furthermore, if you were to try to do it again, you'd probably have 3 different kids. So it is very much different from complicated, which is a Sudoku. And life is inherently complex. So, you have some people that say, well, there's simple tasks, and then there's just complicated tasks, and then there's complex tasks. Well, the reality is, life is inherently, you never know when the otherwise simple task is going to become incredibly complex because of what's going on. And government in particular is complex. One of the things I discovered mid-career when I joined the public service was just how the number of different conflicting interests make it so difficult. And the other thing I will tell you, just to flesh out a little bit more, is the field of research that I studied in, did my doctorate in, was basically inspired by complexity science, and in particular complex adaptive systems. And there's a very famous one, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about, called BOIDS, B-O-I-D-S. I love the name, if nothing else. And what these are just computer programs in which a computer programmer has a whole bunch of agents or lines of code that gives them instructions for how they work together. And in the BOIDS example, which is one of the most basic, because all of the agents are exactly the same, they have 3 rules. Separation, steer to avoid crowding your local flock mates. Alignment, steer towards the average heading of local flock mates. And cohesion, steer to move towards the average position of local flock mates. So with those 3 simple rules, you get the generation of which is why it's called BOIDS, murmurations or flocking patterns, which are complex behaviors. And they are regularly irregular and predictably unpredictable. And that's very much the nature of complexity. And of course, in real life, all the agents are very, very different. And there's millions of them and millions of different things happening. And there are not just 3 rules. And it's also not a contained system. So you can understand how much more complex it gets than even just a model of complexity with in BOIDS. And I guess the other thing we learned from BOIDS in complexity is that what is going on is cannot be predicted or determined. It's actually a result of what everyone is doing together and with each other. So that's why it can make life so difficult for us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as the book is entitled, Managing in Complexity, applies a lot to public servants, just as you said, like the public service and government of Canada is a complex entity to begin with. So I could definitely see that. I'm always trying to simplify life if I can. Do absolutely anything to simplify is kind of like an objective and a road for me.
Yep.
Sudoku, I'll be playing Sudoku maybe a little bit during my holidays. Hoping. What are some of like the key takeaways from, or the implications from this area of research for, and how does it apply to us as managers and leaders?
Well, to talk about this, it means that we're not dealing in an environment which is Newtonian. You can't predict it. You can't necessarily say, if this is going to happen, then that's going to happen. the sort of classical physics and stuff like that. It doesn't work. It's a whole different, it's closer to the theory of relativity kind of complexity. And you can't figure things out with reductionist thinking, which unfortunately, is too often we try to use that, and with not often very good results. But if you just thinking about complexity, there's a bunch of features of a complex system or of complexity that are key. The first one is that it's nonlinear, which means you can't say if this happens, then that will happen. That's what they call linear causality. Well, this is nonlinear. People refer to it as often as the butterfly effect, which for those who like useless pieces of trivia, used to be the flap of a seagull's wings. When Lorenz, who was the mathematician and weather guy who originally wrote about it. But what it means is the effect is not necessarily directly proportionate to the cause. So the smallest little thing can have the hugest of results. Another closely related concept is path dependence, I think of it as sensitivity to initial conditions, which means that history matters. And the choices that we have in front of us and the choices we make will affect our optionality later on. A third one, which is interesting, is paradoxes. So often in the research and in the writing of our thesis and so on in this field of research, we found ourselves writing about paradoxes, which in the sense of the word that you have two things that are seemingly the opposite of each other. They seem to conflict, or they're self-contradictory statements, and they can be true at the same time. So the chicken and the egg, for example, have to spend money to make money, that sort of thing, which is a simple example. But so there's a lot of those. And one in particular we talk about is the fact that the individual is as important as the society and vice versa. And you cannot, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg. It's almost impossible to know. It is impossible to know which comes first. The last two are one of them that we talked about very briefly about Boyd's, is that the system is what they call self-organizing. And what they don't mean by that is that it's organized by the self. It means that nobody can be in charge, because what's going on, as we saw in the Boyd's example, is what everybody is doing as a result of all the actions and interactions and bumping into or avoiding or whatever of others. And the last one is that the whole is not the sum of the parts. So outcomes can't be predicted by understanding either the behavior or the composition of interacting parts of or actors. So you can't predict what's going to happen when you mix A and B. You're not going to necessarily get A and B. You may get Z. You just don't know. So, that's why when you break down to what are the implications of complexity, it explains again in more detail, why it makes things so difficult, and why we can't predict, we can't control, can't determine. There's no magic tools or techniques that I can sell you. If I could, I would, but I can't. That will make everything simple.
So you don't have an answer for me on how to make life simpler? No.
Yeah, no. It's a bit like the unless you use Hitchhiker's Guide number. That's the closest I got.
Awesome. Le monde est assurément complexe. And what you've described definitely sounds like the public service for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about some of this research? It's leading edge, comes from your book, it's based upon, and why it's different from other approaches.
Sure.
Other approaches to management in particular. Yeah.
First of all, I cannot take credit for the research. I mean, yes, I did research for my doctorate, but as we always said, I stood on the shoulders of many, many, many wise people that have come before me, as we all do in almost everything. so you know, it's to them that I pay a lot of of honor to. The just to be very simplistic, I guess, in my description of two of the sort of more usual forms of management thinking. One is has been termed magico-mythical thinking. And it's a bit fantasy laden. This is when, you know, you talk about the special attributes of an individual, the heroic, charismatic leaders. It's very individualistically based. If you get the right person in the job, it'll be simple. If you get the, you know, right tools and techniques, it will be simple. Again, it's very fantasy laden. And it, you know, has predictable results. The other one is which is much more inherent to most of the management processes that are used in most companies, bureaucracies, and so on, is what they call scientific management. It came originally from works such as Frederick Taylor, who was the stopwatch guy that was watching men load and unload pig iron, and he figured that you could break down objectively what the work that had to be done. And he was the time and motion studies guy, and so on and so forth. He said that management is an objective science in which one improves industrial effectiveness through observation and study of the work. In fact, he was even known to say that with the workers in this case, I'll say it, and then you can just reflect on how this might or might not apply to knowledge workers, or really any workers, how it didn't really matter if they were intelligent or not. If they, in fact, it might be better if they were as stupid as an ox. So really quite dismissive. And in the 30s, his star waned a little bit, partly because of the impact of his thinking and on laborers and workers and so on. However, it turned into and developed a continuing thought that that we can be the management is the work of organizing, planning, forecasting, coordinating, controlling. That the manager is a scientist or objective observer and in control of what's going on. And again, it's very individualistic. And pays little attention to the individual freedoms, politics, unknowable nature of the future, disregards our interconnectedness and interdependencies, and heavy reliance on quantification, tools and techniques, concepts like best practice and so on. Performance management, pay for performance, all of those sorts of things are indicative of that sort of scientific management. So what's going over to the complexity management perspective, what's very, very different is just it was inspired obviously by complex adaptive systems and complexity science, as I already said, but it took social theory into account. Now, it's when you think about it, considering management is about managing people, it's a bit of a duh that it took this long to pull in social theory, but it did. And in fact, this is a sort of a fairly recent perspective. The work was done in the late 90s, and they only coined the term of this particular theory in about 2000, 2002. But it draws heavily on pragmatic philosophy, group sociology, and group dynamics. So what I mean by pragmatic philosophy is this is, as we've seen, complexity, you can't predict, control, determine. So there's no real right answer and things are always changing. And so pragmatic philosophy is very helpful for us because this is a social theory that focuses on the human experience and is interested in how ideas work in the real world versus in theory. The usefulness of ideas, policies, and proposals are the criteria of their merit. And a proposition is only true, in quotes, if it works satisfactorily with the recognition that's for now, because you just don't know where it's going to go. Group sociology is a social theory that studies patterns of how we relate to each other in social flux and change and so on. And group dynamics also is studying of patterns that humans produce both consciously and unconsciously when they're working together. And so what we say is that what is going on in the workplace or wherever is a product of what we are all doing together, which is affected by what we believe in, our norms, our values, our emotions, our power dynamics. And out of that, patterns like the murmurations from Boyd's arise, which affect which affect how we relate to one another and are typical of how we relate to one another.
So something very pragmatic that we're talking about these days in the public service, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about values and ethics. We're talking about fiscal restraint, return to office. Now that's a conversation worth having. What advice would you give to managers and leaders who are dealing with hybrid and virtual workplace and return to office? J'aimerais votre conseil. Any advice, Sarah, on this topic?
Oui, c'est vraiment un concept, une situation assez complexe. And one of the reasons is it because, from my perspective, it puts a real focus on thinking about the social aspects of how we work together, because it's changing so significantly, or parts of it are changing so significantly how we interact. There are a number of key implications for how we work together in our practice. Some would be the same in any workplace. However, perhaps it is more important when we're talking about the hybrid or the virtual workplace. Because we have to take into account that we've got very differing ways of how we interact and how we share our spaces with each other. So firstly, no one size fits all. I mean, it really does depend upon the work that's being done. I mean, throughout the pandemic, I mean, there was some work that could not be done virtually or in person, and that will continue to be the case. So there's some work that's done very, very easily. And I guess one of the things that we need to keep into account as a prelude for this is I was still with ESDC, Service Canada, when the pandemic started. And we were a department for which telework had been a definite no-no. I mean, people did do it a bit, but it was not done as an everyday thing. And all overnight we had to go do it. But we started with a workforce that knew each other, that had worked together, that had been in meetings together, and so on and so forth. So, a lot of that social infrastructure, understandings, patterns had already been established. Where it starts to get even more challenging, because, frankly, our experience was, despite this all, well, you won't be able to trust them, they won't work hard, and so on and so forth. People worked really hard. People, did everything to make it, to make it work, to make it successful. And they really showed their mettle, I think, as a public service. Just talking from my own experience. It is more difficult if this becomes something that we have to have as a sustainable way of how we work together. And not necessarily a bad thing, but again, suited to the work. And so on. So what I've indicated in talking about the importance of social theory applying to this, our relationships, our history, how we relate to one another are all important. And one of the key questions that one of the original scholars involved in this, guy called Doug Griffin, who passed away way too soon, he used to say, the key question is, who are we becoming? And I always think of that United Airlines story remember when they Dr. Dow, they dragged off because he wouldn't agree to leave his seat and give his seat up. They dragged him off the plane and knocked him unconscious and so on. And everybody else was saying, well, who's to blame for this? And I'm thinking, gee, the real question is, what on earth is going on? Because it was actually two organizations that were involved in this. What on earth is going on in these organizations to suggest that that's a successful way of interacting with a customer? I mean, like, it's ludicrous when you think about it. but how did they get there? And one of the lines I use quite often is that how we work together today may well determine how we'll work together in the future. So thinking about it in terms of the virtual workplace and so on, yes, there's reduced opportunity for the water cooler discussions, the opportunistic bumping into one another when you're all in the same building. Now, if you're in a large department, as I was, a regional department, we already had that. We had to manage that. So some of the experience and learnings from that would be, is helpful. But so how do you replace some of the ability for water cooler discussions? How do you create a community if people aren't in the same physical space? What I call habitus, or popularly called culture, our assumptions about the way the business is done. You require a lot, the way we do things around here, you require a lot more intentionality of establishing some of those, which means a lot more conversation and discussion and then demonstrated action in base of, not the usual, we'll discuss our values and then we'll put them down and thank God that's done now, we can just keep going on with life. But it becomes even more important to actually be conscious of and integrate some of these into how we work together. One of the interesting things that I saw happening in the period of time that I was still, because I was head of the Atlantic region for Service Canada, there is watching, we'd always had a power dynamic imbalance between headquarters and the regions. Very much headquarters were where it was. We were just doing that delivery thing, go out and do that delivery thing. It's not very difficult, is it? But I noticed even more, there was one or two senior folk who were in the meeting rooms. The rest of us were on what I call Hollywood squares. One individual, incredible, very, very talented person. So this is not to take away from his talent, whatever, but he got so much closer to the deputies because he was in the meetings and nobody else was. We were all in the Hollywood squares. We were all two-dimensional figures there. And it was interesting to watch just how, but more and more, every word he said was taken as golden. And it was much more difficult to bring different perspectives to bear if they disagreed with what he was saying. Again, brilliant guy, did a fabulous job, and so on. One of the things I would also add that advice to managers and leaders is there's a competency called group mindedness, which is what is going on? How am I responding to what others are doing? How are others responding to what I am doing or not doing? And keeping in mind that the signals from you, the boss, are always going to have added punch. And if you're in 2D interaction, not in person, like we experience with emails, it can be so much more challenging in terms of the appropriateness of tenor and the emotive content of your interaction and so on. Another piece of advice I would give is being very wary of certainties. The reality is we are in an uncertain world, and that's the title. But so often we're asked for, what's the answer? What's the right solution here? And unfortunately, the right solution in complexity depends upon who's making the judgment and when they're making it. It's always what's the best we can do in the circumstances? What's a good enough step we can take to acknowledge that in the future we may be facing a whole bunch of different set of problems. And it means that we make plans. We have these lovely glossy strategic plans, which drive me crazy, but we have to hold them lightly and value optionality. A couple more things. Very important, productive doubt is very, very important, because that's how you get at different perspectives and values. And it's not a question of a right value or a wrong value, but of how do we find the possibility of acting to take as many as possible into account. So again, you get into this, how do you make it safe for people to raise conflicting perspectives? And it is that much more difficult in a virtual world where you perhaps don't have a sense of how somebody's going to react. Can they be trusted to take good advice? And so you actually need to make it very explicit how differing perspectives are raised. And one example, that's inherent through all of this, my thesis was actually on trust. Trust, as we know, is very fragile. It's reciprocal. If you don't trust me, then I'm not going to trust you, and vice versa. And it's also emotive. I mean, you can't separate the emotional from the cognition. And yet trust, while it does have its, groupthink and difficult aspects, it is particularly important in how we work together because it allows us to perhaps trust that we will be listened to trust that somebody is saying something that we think is absolutely wacky, but wait a second, I know Gina. She's seen something the rest of us haven't seen. And it's absolutely really, really important. So that's some sort of general advice. And again, a lot of it is stuff that advice I would give in any event for any workplace, but it becomes that much more important when you've got the issue of hybrid and hybrid and virtual workplaces.
Yeah. So yeah, as mentioned in the chat, please offer your questions or comments. We're talking now about hybrid and virtual workplaces, and I just wanted to comment a little bit, Sarah. Like I agree. Like it's kind of like we got to be careful about being so categorical about things, right? Because most things are great, and in a complex entity like the public service, it's really hard to sort of come down on an absolute categorical fact because there's so much that you uncover as you engage and so on. And the other point, who are we becoming? I think is a question that senior leaders, others have asked ourselves. If we're going completely virtual, how do we pass on those cues, those stories, those values, for instance? How do we effectively influence one another if we're just in the Hollywood squares, as you put it? So like I think it's a fascinating journey for sure that we're heading into this hybrid workplace, and we'll be watching it and studying it, and probably others will be writing books about it as we go ahead in life. So it's really fascinating. Again, want to get very practical about things we can do to operate in this new world more effectively. I want to stay on the hybrid piece only because it's of such interest. What practical things we can do, Sarah?
Yeah, and that's what it always boils down to. I mean, that's the pragmatic side, the pragmatic philosophy. I guess one thing is building on my point that the difference during the pandemic was we entered into it with an established workforce with understandings about each other and whether we trusted or didn't trust or whatever already there. It makes onboarding, bringing new people in, something that is more than just, you have to actually think of how do they become socialized, and not in a bad way, but in a good way, in terms of understanding, what works, what doesn't work. They can understand who they can trust and so on. And hopefully they can trust managers and leaders. Not always, but hopefully they can. So onboarding becomes something that becomes particularly important. And it may be that the way of working will be different for those coming in. And that you actively seek opportunity for them to socially interact with, socially and professionally interact with people who have been in the workplace for varying lists of time. And so they can sort of help or perhaps it's as seeking mentors, as an advisor in the culture, and so on. A coach perhaps, but a coach from inside, not an independent outside coach, because you need somebody who really understands the workplace and what works and what rules are flexible, what rules are absolutely not flexible, and so on. And it goes to the nature of work. And while we're all engaged in collective working because we perform as a collective, there are some ones that are much more interdependent, some roles that are much more interdependent with each other on an ongoing basis. And so again, that the nature of the work makes a big difference. I would advise people to be really intentional about the use of in-person time and interaction. So I've been hearing stories of people coming in for their in-person days and then ending up spending the time on Hollywood Squares meetings, or because there's less workspace available, and nobody wanted it to happen this way, not being able to work together with their colleagues. That is kind of the worst of both worlds in some cases, and it's so I think you need to think differently. When people are in together, maybe that's the time for certain of meetings and so on. And maybe, I don't want to go overboard on the social side of things, but one of the things when I joined Atlantic Canada Service Canada was we had an okay relationship with the union reps, but I believe that unions are incredibly important. Especially in a large or complex organization, they're incredibly important. And they provide a lot of support to people that need it. They provide warnings that before things go off the rails and become too difficult. And so very much a believer in unions. And the relationship was kind of transactional. One of the things that I started to do was, before we had an in-person meeting, the night before, whoever was there, and bit by bit, I enticed my executives to join me because I think they knew it was expected. But we'd have dinner together with the union reps. And I tried to make sure that we didn't have union on one side and management on the other, but that people were mixed up a bit. I wanted them to talk about their pets and their kids and, the car that just broke down or whatever it was. I wanted them to talk and see each other as people. And I really do believe that is part of what started to help us get to a relationship where we weren't always in agreement, and then we shouldn't always be in agreement, but where we were able to, I could get the calls or send the calls that weren't happening and saying, guys, you need to look at this. This is a problem. And it kept everybody safe. It looked after the employees. It dealt with problem spots. And we also gave each other better advice because we had a better relationship. But you have to be intentional about that. Focus on relationships with direct reports, because you can't, it's harder to, cover the ambit. I mean, as for example, as a deputy, you have a representational role very much with employees throughout the organization. But it's really important to, as I know, knowing you, Gina, you already do this, but it's the interacting with the direct reports, the focusing on developing those relationships so that you can work together and there can be trust and there can be agreement to disagree. One of the things that I used to do when I was hiring somebody who was working with me closely was basically used to say to them, if you can't come into my office and tell me when I'm screwing up, don't come work for me. And it saved me from a lot of stubbed toes and worse, because they did. So, sometimes too often than I'd like to admit. But the other thing is the other interesting thing about in person versus whatever is gossip. Gossip is something that gets a bad name. However, gossip is really important in terms of knowing who you can trust and who you can't trust and so on. And there's, in fact, there's theses that have been written on praise and blame gossip and all kinds of different gossip. But again, that is something that you want to have some of the in-person, and not that I'm a fan of malicious gossip or whatever, but even the chatting about what went on and the stories and so on. I mean, that's all forms of gossip, and it can be good information in terms of building relationships. I talked a bit about productive doubt. Again, you have to be aware as a manager or leader that when you sometimes if you set up the question, you set up the answer that you expect. And so to be very careful sometimes about raising the parameters. And so one of the things I used to do, and you can do it with Hollywood Squares, and you can also do it when you have your in-person, is I used to have, when I could manage it, an open part of the agenda, 1-2 hours, if it was like a day-long meeting of my team, in which there was nothing in the agenda, completely open. And so, most of the time, after people got comfortable with it, after the first kind of strained meeting or so on, when everybody just sort of sat around and looked around and what are we supposed to do here? But it became one of the best, because people would say, I'm concerned about this. And then somebody else would say, oh yeah, I'm seeing that too. And before you know it, we're problem solving and we're trying to understand what's going on. And it becomes a really important meeting. So big fan of that. And of course, you have to, be, again, very intentional about encouraging people to speak up with it when they have a different perspective. Because I've had the experience of being shut down. I write about it in my book. And, maybe I was way off the mark, but the point was what that told me was I was not trusted. And because I was not trusted, the relationship in that case was very much harmed. And also prevented my different perspective for right or, for good or for ill coming through. Online meetings, one of the things that Laurie McDonald, who was our COO at the time, I'm one of the biggest fans of, I just love her. And she actively would warm up. She would open it up with some quote or some dreadful knock joke. They were truly dreadful, but they were wonderful. Or we had a pet day when we introduced our pets, or we had funny hat day or something like that. Didn't take much time. And, because we were constrained for time. So it wasn't like we had, all day to do these fun things. But it normalized the fact that we were all people dealing with our personal lives and our struggles during the pandemic, some more than others. And the other thing to be careful with in meetings, to be aware of, are what had become rituals. Just the way we do things around here, the things we talk about, the things we don't talk about, the things that it's not okay. I mean, I think I talk in the book about the time when I was in a meeting and I was expressing concerns about the budget that had been proposed at the invitation of the deputy to be, this is a difficult budget. I want everybody to be frank and speak up if they have a problem with it. What I didn't understand was, no, that was just the ritual. You say that because that way everybody can sort of say, no, wise leader, this is perfect and this is great and we're going to go and make this work. And of course, I have a bit of a Tigger in me, and so I jumped right in and sort of stepped in it. But having said that, ritual can get in the way and shut things down. The other thing that I have a real problem with is PowerPoints. During the first days of COVID, when we were in meetings every day, half the time at the beginning, we didn't even have an agenda, but they evolved into a sort of an order that worked. And we weren't using PowerPoints because we didn't have time. And it was interesting, after I had left, I'd moved on to be public servant in residence at Dalhousie. Apparently they were starting to reappear when I had left. And they're back. And, the comment I made to a friend of mine was saying, in my view, the more the PowerPoints, the worse the discussion. And she says, absolutely. Because people spend so much time, it's the old joke of, okay, you and I, intelligent people, get together and read PowerPoints together. And it becomes even more of a temptation again, and even more difficult in an online world. So being really, I would be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how PowerPoints are used. A couple of last things. One of the things I write about, and we talk about a lot in this field of research, is called phronesis, which is practical knowledge, which is in the times of professional managers. You can be a manager and manage anything. Well, the reality is that phronesis is the knowing how. It's what happens, what accumulates after years and years of working in an area, and it's developed through experience and interactions and so on. It's just that feeling in your gut, which is a source of wisdom, which is actually so much more apt for complexity, because what it is based upon experience. You become aware of when the patterns are changing. You know when things are evolving according to the pattern that you're used to or not. And it becomes very, very important. And I think I don't have the answer for this. It's an important question as to how we develop that. Well, I mean, it will develop, but I think it's a bit more challenging in a hybrid workplace. And it'd be very different depending upon the nature of the work as well. But so thrown a bunch of things at you. I guess I would add the competencies, because I know that's what we like to talk about in the federal government, that I would really, reflexivity is this ability to question what's going on and think about what's going on for others and how you're affecting others. Group-mindedness. And what a girlfriend of mine who did the program with me and from Norway used to call friction competence. The ability to deal with the inevitable friction that we deal with interpersonal. And those would be three ones that I would suggest you keep in mind. So again, lots of stuff. We could talk for hours on this.
No kidding. Yeah, no, that's fabulous. I really took a lot away from that. I know that Sarah, you and I used to gossip a little bit. I'd rather call it chit chat,
Chit-chat,
jazzy.
Yeah, jazzy.
But what I take away from this was the conversation we just had about trust and relationships being key. And I think we got to Nadia, one of Nadia's questions that came up here about building trust. For me, I would just say, really just being genuine, being yourself, your whole self, and bringing your whole self to work is really a way to open up that trust, and just having, just being able to know that you got each other's back is really important. For me, I use that triangle. You got to make sure you're communicating to your superiors, your partners sideways, but also to your direct reports, as you said. Building trust with them is absolutely key. And I think if you think about it all around in that holistic way, you could develop trust and relationships all around. And your other point about fun, it's got to be fun, right? If it's not fun, why bother, right? I mean, it's
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Gina, I'll share a story with the group about when you and I were working together, and I was early on in the department, and
I was probably one of those that came to your office and said, "Stop doing something."
No, you weren't. No, what it was a piece of work that was going around, and they couldn't figure out where to put it, and I was, being my officious self about budgets and stuff like that. And I remember you phoned me and said, "Look, Sarah, I don't, it doesn't really matter. We'll make it work in terms of the thing. But if you're really worried about it, I consider you a friend and a good colleague. So we'll take it on. Don't you worry about it." And I just thought, oh, I felt so awful because that was more the approach, and I learned so much from that one interaction, which you probably just did naturally never thought about again. Uh, but that's a building trust moment, and the thing about trust is just one breach. It's a certainty uncertainty thing. It's the knowing that you'll have my back, and the problem is in the one breach, you have undone all the certainty before, not you, Gina, but you as the general, and which is why it's so fragile. And you've got all these expression, comes crawling in and leaves in a Ferrari or whatever. But it's a history. It's actually trust is a patterning of how we relate to each other, which does develop, and it develops through the signals you send, by the way you answer stuff, the way you do things, the way you stand up for somebody, or sort of all of that sort of stuff, and how you react when you stumble and perhaps breach an understanding. If how you react to that can either destroy it or can actually get to be, oh, that was just a mistake. That I actually can trust that person, because so
owning mistakes is another good thing.
Owning mistakes is a huge thing. I mean, I had a circumstance where I had a more terse than necessary email sent out about something and someone, I didn't know the name of the person, but and I was going through, a girlfriend of mine was just in the middle of doing MAID and all of that, so I was discombobulated to the effect, but still no excuse. One of my staff reached out to me with an email saying, Sarah, we don't do things like that around here. And it just hit me, and so I sent an email to everybody that had been copied on the previous one saying, mea culpa, I did wrong on that, and so on. And I felt really bad. Turns out this woman had been, she'd lost her sister within the year, and she was just, not there. I mean, God love her. So we had a wonderful conversation. But anyways, all that to say, it's admitting you're wrong, because there's so much we don't know.
There's so much we don't know, and for sure, I've made tons of, I've had a long career too, so I've made tons of mistakes along the way, and reflecting on them is a great thing, a great learning moments, a lot of great learning moments. We have so many questions in the chat, Sarah. I don't even know where to start. It's like we're already at 12:53 and we have 7 minutes left. So I don't know what to do with all of these, but there's questions around relationships. There's questions around hybrid, just sharing, going through so many practical questions. I don't know how we're going to get to them. Maybe you can comment on them at some point, Sarah, if you have a chance after this.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm doing is writing mini blogs on things, and I was thinking this morning that it'd be really helpful to get a source of questions from them. So if there's any way they can be captured, because I know this is being recorded, but if the chats can be captured, I'd be I obviously hard to respond to all of them, but I would love to get them, and then I would be more than happy to sort of respond to some of the themes.
That sounds like a great idea. Yeah,
I would love that. And the other thing is, I'd also be happy if people want to connect with me on LinkedIn and pass along their questions there. I'd be more than happy to respond to them too.
That is like super generous of you, Sarah, to do that. Maybe I'll start to just wrap up a little bit. And again, managing in complexity, how our fears of uncertainty can hurt us and what to do about it. And again, just reflecting on this whole conversation, it is really about managing an uncertainty. Ambiguity is probably another word, and the better we get at managing complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, the better public servants we become, right? Like, I mean, and it's I think that's one of the themes, but you base it all on research, and you base it all on certain theories that have come about as part of your studies. Is there anything that you want to share, final thoughts and words about this conversation, or any of the pieces we've covered?
Well, I think one thing that I would like to stress, because it was a real light bulb goes on moment for me, although it didn't happen just overnight, was the whole paradox of the individual and society. Because we live in a world that honors the individual, and forgets about the importance of society. I mean, the common good is always put to one side.
The collective, for sure. Like it's
Yeah.
about collective.
You know, we've been demonizing unions, not so I don't think in the public service, because I think there's a pretty good relationship there, although obviously appropriately fractious from time to time. But in society, you know, the collective interest has almost been demonized, and yet, you know, what I have learned from living in a small community here, which I absolutely adore, is that the individual is just as this is what the paradox is just as important as the society, and vice versa. Not only that, but the individual has more worth if the collectivity has more worth. I'll
You're
finish up.
talking about my culture, Sarah.
Yes, I know. And you know, but it's changed the way I look at life. And it's absolutely fascinating. And just a tiny anecdote, perhaps to wind up, but there was I was driving by in Halifax, nearby city, and this woman on the corner, and I sort of looked at her and just sort of, you know, looked away, just, oh, well, whatever. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, if she looks just like this woman from my community. And this woman is not the closest of friends, but she's a dear friend, if you know what I mean. She can sing beautifully, plays a mean accordion, avid bicyclist, just lost her husband, was really sad. We're all very sad. And just a delightful, warm, you know, just a beacon. And I would never dismiss her, ever.
Yeah.
But then I thought, because she's important to the community. And so the individual in an individualistic world actually gets reduced, in my view. The stronger the community, and the stronger are the individuals. And it goes into a workplace as well, because we do tend to, we are really running late. Anyways, I'll wrap it up saying that, you know, thinking about that is a huge learning, was a huge learning for me, and something I would commend to the rest of you.
Wise words to wrap up. Thank you so much on my behalf and on Sarah's behalf. I will turn it back to David for final thoughts.
All right. Well, thank you both. That was terrific. And certainly we could have gone another 30 minutes. I'm really sorry that I missed the days of gossip with the two of you, but I'm sure you weren't gossiping. I'm sure you were just interpreting the workplace. And so, Sarah, it's a shame that I wasn't there for Pet Day or Funny Hat Day, because I wasn't having those types of days at the Ontario government. And thank you for your comment, and to those who jumped in about PowerPoints. Yes, we all need to be having the conversations as opposed to just looking at paper words. So thank you so much for this authentic conversation, and thank you to our audience. Sarah, if you're interested, we can share the outstanding questions with you, and you could write a story in our monthly newsletter and answer the questions. Just a reminder to everyone that we will send you the recording, and look for that story in our monthly newsletter. And please check out our website for upcoming events. And of course, our annual conference is in Winnipeg this year, October 2nd to 4th, and we hope many of you of an opportunity to participate either in person or virtually. Again, thank you so much, Gina and Sarah. We really appreciate it, and have a great day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much.